Welcome to the Underwater Podcast, where we take a deep dive into the world of underwater portrait photography, cinematography, and everything in between. With me, your host, Brett Stanley. Welcome back to the Underwater Podcast. And this week, my guest is Ian Seabrook, a Canadian underwater camera operator and DP who spends most of his time working between Canada, America, and the UK. His work includes scenes from features like Deadpool 2, Batman vs Superman, Lost in Space, and the Pirates of the Caribbean. We talk about learning underwater photography from Nat Geo legend David Doubilet, the importance of an open and sharing film community, and how a great assistant can make life easier. We also talk about him nearly being crushed by logs and rolling icebergs in the Arctic. Okay, let's dive in. Oh, and keep an ear out for Ian's crack at an Aussie accent. It's pretty good. Ian, welcome to the Underwater Podcast.
Hello, Brett. How are you?
I'm good, man. Yeah. It's what is it, like 9:15 in the morning for me, and I am trying to wake up, which tells you a little bit about my lifestyle. How are you? Where are you based at the moment?
Between Los Angeles and Vancouver in Canada.
Oh, nice.
So, I kind of split my time, or in some years I don't split at all. I stay with one. Like last year I worked all in the US, so I wasn't in Canada at all last year. But my kids live in Vancouver. So when I'm not working, I try to, they're, 20 and 18 now. So, I have to schedule time with them as opposed to,
the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, we're going here. It's like, well, no, we're not, because guess what? I've got a car now and I can go where I want.
I got a whole life now. Yeah. So exactly. Are you Canadian, or do you have a visa Canadian there?
Yeah, no, I'm born in Canada, and I also have a United States passport. So I got my green card a couple of years ago based on my resume from underwater work.
Oh, okay.
So that's enabled me to. I used to live in the United States. I used to live in LA in the early '90s when I got married at a film school, and so I lived down in LA during the riots, and then. Yeah, so I've been experienced.
You've come full
I'm not an experienced rioter or anything, but I just experienced that point in history and the kind of grip that it held over the city. Now that was a city issue, wasn't a world issue or a country issue.
Yeah, that was the Rodney King riots.
That's correct. Yeah, and I think there was some, as they say, civil unrest in other cities, but it was nowhere near the destruction that Los Angeles went through during that time frame. So yeah, I've lived in LA before, and I lived in Seattle for a while, and so yeah, I'm kind of back and forth all over the place.
Yeah. So you're in an interesting position where and just looking from your resume and stuff, so you work between the US, Canada, and also the UK?
Correct, yeah. And I think 2018 I was kind of all over the place. I was in Norway, I was in Mexico, lived in Australia for a couple of years. It was back in the probably late 1980s. And that's in fact where I learned how to dive. Oh, right. So, yeah.
Where in Australia were you?
I did every part of the continent except for Western Australia, which is, yes, it's half the continent. I get it. But, I think most people end up just going to Fremantle and Perth. They don't actually go through the Gibson Desert and say that they've seen the whole country. But so I missed Western Australia and I missed Tasmania, more due to the fact I think I had missed the ferry at that point and just wanted to keep moving. So,
okay. Were you road tripping, or were you working,
backpacking around, that kind of thing. And so, my mom had died and I needed to go. I always talked about this with her. I always wanted to go to Australia when I was, when I was a teenager, I guess it was. And it was likely, I think the big push of it was probably when I saw the Mad Max movies. Like a lot of people, they all wanted to go and, drive their cars fast.
Because that was like a tourism video really for Australia as opposed to a fictional film.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally. But I'd always been interested in Australian cinema, and I'd seen it was a great film I saw. I think it was called Ground Zero, that had Colin Farrell's in it, and Jack Thompson and Donald Pleasance. Anyway, it was about this military cover-up about a news cameraman's father who documented mistreatment of Aborigines in the 1950s or 60s, I think, and basically the government tried to cover it up. Anyway, whatever. I thought it was an interesting concept, but I think if you watch the film now, it's quite dated. But anyway, regardless, so had that interest in Australian cinema, not just the Mad Max stuff, and then so anyway, I always wanted to go, and I went after my mom passed away. And so got myself up to Queensland. That's where all the diving was, of course. And it was, the Great Barrier Reef. And I did a course with a company called Dive. I think their logo was a koala bear with a mask and a snorkel on its head.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of people on the boat. I mean, it was a lot of different nationalities, Dutch, German, British, United States. I was the only person from Canada, I think. And regardless, we did night diving, and we did basically everybody got certified, and it was a live aboard boat out on the reef. I can't remember exactly where it was in regards to the physical location on the reef, but and basically before we went out, I'm backpedaling a little bit, was that the reason that I got interested in underwater cinematography in general was attributed to Jacques Cousteau, any of the National Geographic documentaries that I saw when I was a kid growing up on, or the Wild World of Disney or the Wild World of Sports or any of that kind of stuff. And then, of course, as far as theatrical films were concerned, Thunderball, although I wasn't born when the film came out, but, my dad's from the UK, so he basically would wake me up and make me watch these, movies. There was no, there was no VCR back then when I was just growing up. So
you had to wait for it to come on television.
Yeah, he would usually be a midnight screening or something like that, or anytime we spent all of our Christmases in the UK. So it was like, tonight's family drama is You Only Live Twice, and everybody getting blown away, right? So it's like, I was introduced to. And it's the same thing everybody does, right? They try to hold their breath for as long as the characters in the film are doing it. And of course, when you're not trained to do it, you end up turning blue or whatever, right? So
So and if you're trying to follow James Bond through one of those things as well, because he holds his breath for an inordinate amount of time on screen.
Yeah, while swimming and fighting off sharks or fighting people or whatever it was.
Yeah,
right?
Or breathing through a very long straw, like a bamboo reed or something. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So it was that was an early influence, and Jacques Cousteau was, of course, it was the only thing that was on, really. I mean, I know Pete Romano would reference the Sea Hunt and stuff and Flipper and stuff like that. I think I'd watched a lot of that when I was super young. But regardless, when I finally got to Australia, the dive shop that they were getting all the equipment from to get out on this liveaboard, they had a couple of underwater plexiglass housings and they also had disposable cameras. So the plexiglass housings were for, at the time, whatever the sport kind of camera was. It certainly wasn't a professional SLR camera. It was, what I mean by that, it wasn't like a Nikon. It was probably some...
like a Ricoh or...
Maybe, yeah. And so then they also had the disposable. You basically just take the photos, take it underwater, and then you send the whole camera in to get developed, and you get your.
Was that a blue camera? Like, was it made out of blue plastic?
I see. It was blue or yellow, one of the two. I can't remember.
I used to have a couple of those. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you would send the entire camera away, and then hopefully you would come back with some prints.
Yeah, you go back to it would have to be, I think we must have been up in Cairns somewhere. Yeah. And when the boat returned, and it basically said, you just take it right down there to the postie, and you get your prints back, but just make sure you get back, by the time you're going to leave, don't take off and leave, and then your prints are going to be there. You're like, oh, okay. So I got this, it was all slide film, chrome film. When I got the pictures back, I was pretty enamored of the whole process of taking photos underwater. The fact that I was breathing underwater was also another anomaly that I think you've discussed this topic prior, but when did you first put your face in the water, and when did you breathe off of a regulator or a snorkel or whatever it was? At the time that we were doing the pool training, when I submerged, and you're really not sure what you're going to do here, when you started to inhale off of the regulator, I'd say 2/3 of the class bolted out of the pool
to the surface.
They felt so claustrophobic, confined, paranoid, or whatever the reactions were. And basically at the time it wasn't sort of how did you feel about that? it was, well, you don't like it or you stayed down. It was one of the two. So I think there was like 3 of us that stayed down, and I kept kind of looking over at people going, wow, so obviously I reacted to it positively. And so took the camera. I think I was the only person who spent more money, because obviously the camera rental was more money, and you had to, if you wanted to rent it, you could, but it wasn't provided for you. So I spent more money, and everybody at the time was all on a budget, and they're all worrying about buying beers over camera rentals. So I chose the camera rental, and I still have the slides. I mean, basically it's great. a lot of shots of bleached coral, and there's a couple groupers, and I think I turned the camera on myself, and I have
took the world's first underwater selfie.
Maybe, yeah, but I just didn't promote it on Instagram, so someone's
which
beat
means
me
it's
there.
Not real, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, never happened.
If it's not on Instagram, it never happened, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the outfit was like, neon pink or neon yellow or something like that. It was some outfit that, of course,
because it was the 80s, right?
Yeah, it was like, it was the late 80s, and so that was kind of the, and so finished that, and I was at a bit of a crossroads. My mom had passed away. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, and then I was traveled around a bit, and then I worked in Australia for a couple of years on the Sydney Water Board with a lot of Italian and Portuguese immigrants. I was like the only white guy there who was not speaking with an accent, but anyway.
And the water board is basically the equivalent of like city water and power.
That's correct. Yeah. So it was laying and erecting clay sewer pipe and digging trenches and ditches and a lot of, but it was up in Avalon Beach. And I remembered that Peter Garrett from Midnight Oil had a property up there. I remember that much. That at least stuck in my head. So, but Avalon Beach is where all the good surfing was, I think.
Were you a surfer as well?
I tried it. I'm not going to say that I'm a surfer. I would never call myself that. I think I've moved into paddleboarding more than surfing. I think I want more of a workout although surfing is quite a workout, especially when you first start doing it, and you get quite humbled quite quickly. So any of the surfing that I've done cold water surfing, and I've done warm water surfing, and it's if diving connected and it made you want to pursue it, some of the people have the same reaction with, obviously with surfing, and that never really connected to me. I preferred watching it more than doing it. And for a while there, I think I've got a sort of vast collection of surf porn documentaries. They're not really documentaries. It's basically like, hip music. Hip music with great
shots of surfers. And,
all shot at 120 frames or whatever it is.
Exactly. And, it's the same thing with like ski and snowboarding videos. It's like, this is not a documentary.
This is just snow porn or whatever it is. Yeah,
exactly.
Totally. But so did that. And so in New Zealand, walking around the north end of the island, Cape Reinga.
So you went to New Zealand as well?
Yeah, I finished work up in Australia, and then when I wanted to travel around New Zealand, so I spent another 6 months traveling almost. Yeah, I would say almost every square inch of the country. And I planned to go diving, and I got in the water, but it was more snorkeling stuff. And I was really surprised at how cold the water was, as I figured it would be the same temperature as Australian waters, but didn't do any diving in New Zealand. And I thought I would come back one day. But so basically I said to myself, okay, what is it you want to do? Well, I really like documentaries, and I really like diving, and I like photography. So I'd like to combine all those disciplines into one. And so I kind of made my mind up right then and there. I was going to be an underwater documentary cameraman. Wow. And there's no schooling for it. Right. At the time, there wasn't. I mean, I think there might be some courses there might have been a photographic course at the Brooks Institute in Santa Barbara. But it was, again, when you've just spent most of your money traveling around the South Pacific, I stopped on a few other islands as well, and, basically had no money left, and had to, I think I had to landscape in order to get some quick money to find a film school that would be quick, not a 5-year course at NYU or USC or UCLA and I think basically if I had really narrowed my search at the time, I'm not even sure. So basically I went to film school and I got into the film industry, and then I worked as a camera assistant, as a second assistant, and then I moved up to a focus puller and worked down in LA, and I worked in Vancouver as well. And basically, there was only one person at the time who was doing, well, there was one person on the West Coast it was Pete Romano or Al, it's actually two people. There's Pete Romano and Al Giddings who were doing all the movie work. And then Jordan Klein was still doing the work in Florida. So basically on the two coasts you had, and there seemed to be nobody in the central region of the country. Just like one or two guys would do everything. Right. And Giddings tended to do documentary and feature film work. Whereas I think that Pete early in his career was strictly concentrating on feature film work. Yeah. And so I did meet Pete when I was down in Los Angeles in the early 90s. And I went to Hydroflex after it had changed its name from Hydro Image to Hydroflex.
Okay. Yeah.
And, it was a really small, basically the machine shop and the office were all kind of one area. Right. They had a testing tank, a small little testing tank, little dump tank, not dissimilar from what they have there at the facility now.
The facility's like 10 times the size.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing about Pete that I will say is he was extremely generous with his time. He was extremely generous with his knowledge. And what I mean by time is, I kept him on the phone probably for about an hour or so. Yeah, and, because in Los Angeles, it was very difficult to break into the film industry. It always has been a business, but at the time it was even more closed. If you weren't in the union, which is, it's a kind of a catch-22, you needed experience to get under the roster, or you needed experience to be considered to get into the union. And if you didn't have any experience, then you were looking at non-union work, because that basically you weren't going to be anybody shooting anything in anything major, because that was taken up by the people who were already doing it and had already spent a long journeyman's time frame getting themselves established in that role. And
they were in the union.
Correct. And I think that a lot of people, especially in today's society, will want the gratification, or they will want something quicker than it took the people who came before them. The time that it takes to learn your trade or your craft, I always looked at it as I was always learning. I was willing to learn. I was willing to put the time in, and I was obsessed and enthusiastic. So all those qualities went into also, a hard work ethic. You just knew that it wasn't going to be, and even still, like the first film that I shot underwater, feature film that I shot, was a low budget horror film, and Pete Romano started the same. I think he almost started the same way. Or it's no one's gonna give you Avatar. You're gonna be working, and I think that way that's the way that it should be. I think that in my personal experience, I know I worked as an underwater assistant and underwater focus puller, and actually laying marks and calibrating lenses underwater, and working with anamorphic lenses, and working with VistaVision cameras, and all this kind of stuff that it's not really done much anymore. I think a lot of obviously a lot of the technology has changed, but I feel that my education with film technology, with film cameras and underwater camera housings, and the evolution of how those camera housings got smaller and lighter from what they were. If you examine the housing that was built by Panavision, it wasn't actually built by Panavision. It was probably built by Lynn Jackish in San Diego. I think he had a hand in it. I could be wrong about that, but there was a housing that was built for Thunderball. They did some tests with it, and then they abandoned that because I believe that Lamar Bourne had his camera housings. Lamar Bourne is the underwater cinematographer who shot all the underwater work on Thunderball and The Spy Who Loved Me and For Your Eyes Only, and one or two other, maybe Moonraker. I think they might have had something in there. Anyway, so he was the kind of go-to guy that the Bond franchise used, and spectacular underwater work. It's still, to this day, I think it's unparalleled, really.
And that scene from Thunderball is epic, with I don't know how many people are underwater in those shots at one time, but that is insane.
That would almost never be. I would just say, you can probably safely say it would never be done again. At the time, certainly some of the practices they were doing as far as the shark containment were concerned, or spearing live sharks and stuff. That would be
absolutely.
That would not be tolerated at all, nor should it be. But so yeah, a lot of those guys were from the Florida school scuba shops and stuff. So they had so many people in there, and I don't think a lot of them were stuntmen. I think most of them were just divers. And then so when you're looking at productions like that, and I think so I basically had made my mind up that was what I was going to do. And then, went to see The Abyss, and that further cemented it. And again, that's another production that's had an influence on me and will never be repeated again. And, I think that the logistics were so insurmountable that anybody with any producer in their right mind would never allow that to happen. They would just say, well, now the technology has changed so much that they're doing a lot of what was considered pretty bad back in the 80s was dry for wet. And to me, it always still looks bad. It's never looked convincing enough. And I think that there's even the current versions of it that I've seen in films like Justice League or Aquaman. I think that is still, it's, to me, there's a suspension of disbelief, and you have to take for granted that it's digital. It's not supposed to be realistic or that kind of stuff.
Well, it's an interesting kind of point, actually, because the dry for wet stuff, I think, depending on the film, so something like Aquaman, where I think we're so trained now with these DC Marvel films that to know that none of it's real anyway, so we're not expecting it to look real. Whereas, if you're doing something like, like The Shape of Water, which I was very disappointed to find out had very little underwater, wet for wet scenes.
Correct.
Most of it was dry for wet. And, people are shocked when they find out that wasn't shot underwater. It's kind of, when it's done well, I think it's really well. But when it's in these films like Aquaman and, any of these other DC ones, people just don't expect it. They don't mind that it doesn't look as real as it probably could.
No, I think you're correct. I think it depends on, obviously all the underwater guys will look at it and go, that's fake.
Yeah.
And then
totally.
now I'm pulled out of the film. But so, I've worked on both. I've worked on done a few Marvel films, but I shot the underwater unit on Deadpool 2. Yeah. And that was all done practically, even though they did augment other world element. I think there's also a sequence in that we spent about a week and a half shooting it, and they cut it out of the film. It's never probably going to be seen, but which is too bad, because it showcases how great Ryan Reynolds is with his breath hold. And there's another performer, Morena Baccarin, I think. I'm not sure if I'm saying her name correctly or not. She played
the other lead in the film.
Correct. That's his girlfriend or his wife or whatever. But she had some water phobia and overcame that. And, the water phobia is one thing, but then being able to actually do your job and act underwater is another issue altogether. And so, you realize that some of these people are really pushing through elements of sheer fear, and they're able to communicate their role or their character at the same time and not panic. It doesn't always happen. I've obviously, I think anybody who's done any work underwater with cast on film sets has realized that before you roll the camera, there's a very large chance that you're only going to get one take out of whatever you're shooting, because it's their comfort level, which to me has always been paramount. I always make sure when I'm, working in these situations, especially in dealing with overhead environments, which is, that can be tough enough for people who are on the crew or the safety divers. Everybody says, I'm good to go and stuff, but I always do a double check that people are okay, because not everybody is okay in an overhead environment where there's no escape route that's easily viewable. Or
and by overhead, you're kind of referencing like if you're shooting under ice or in like in a sunken car or something where you can't reach the surface easily.
That's correct. That's correct. So anytime, I know we've kind of skipped ahead a little bit here, but anytime there's been any prep work involved or meetings about initially, people trapped in cars. It's a common thing that I've shot quite a lot of. Anybody who's done this job has ended up shooting a lot of that, I think, as well.
Yeah.
But essentially, it's how are you going to get them out? And basically, whenever these meetings happen, you have to have, I feel, some sort of a plan in place, or talk to the special effects coordinators and how they're planning on. Usually it's obviously the vehicle going in the water has been prepped to go in the water so that's not leaking fluids and oil and petrol and all this other kind of stuff. But there's got to be, the suspension of the vehicle, if it's just being placed on the bottom of if it's a river, a lake, or a tank or what have you. But there always has to be, the safety of the cast for me is always paramount, because without them, you can shoot it with stunt doubles, but you're not going to get any close-ups. And indeed, that has happened. That has been the case where the cast are not comfortable enough to do a wide shot, which then pushes into a close-up, and you can see that it's the same person, irrespective of whether the editor is going to cut the shot, and then they would never know anyway.
Yeah.
But so basically, it all goes back to any of the pleasure dives that I've done in Hawaii or Mexico or French Polynesia, where there were caves involved, and there was no film crew there. We were going in just to have a look around. I've been in a cave with a guy who freaked out, and I kind of still remembered some of the first dive lessons that I had back in the 80s in Australia. And the instructor's name was Peter. I can't remember his last name. He said, don't ever come over close to someone who's panicking. And also know that if you don't ever offer them your primary regulator.
Okay.
And so then there was there was some questions like, well, how are you supposed to buddy breathe then? He's like, well, you go ahead and try that. When someone's panicking, they're never going to give you the regulator back and you'll drown. Yeah. So if you've given your primary up, you have to have a hand on it, anyway, all these sorts of things. So that what he said came back during this one incident where this one gentleman from Scotland got disoriented, and the person leading the dive kind of knew where they were going. They'd done this dive several times, went into this cave, and there was a skeleton of a turtle. And I thought, well, that's not good. The turtle drowned, and the skeleton was completely intact. So obviously, like the turtle drowned, and I guess everything kind of just sort of fell off it. Like the shell went somewhere else. So anyway, it doesn't matter. But the guy, the Scottish guy, got quite disoriented, and I remembered staying quite far away from him, but I made sure that he could see. I found the exit hole to get out, and I guided him out. But I stayed a good 15 feet, 12 feet away from him, because I knew if he got on top of me, that would be the end of that. So we both would have not made it out. So anyway, I know I've kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but it's basically, right. I would say that I started this as a underwater stills photographer. And I don't mean to say that in an arrogant way. I just mean to say it. And that was my interest. So because I hadn't taken a film camera underwater, a motion picture camera underwater. And we basically went off to the Channel Islands, and I think we spent a lot of time diving around Anacapa. Yeah. And basically I had purchased a Nikonos 5, which is a film camera, and a non-reflex viewfinder. And I had the standard thing that everybody could find at the time was the Nikonos camera with a 35 millimeter lens. And when you're looking through the finder on the camera is basically a rangefinder with a guesstimate of the markings on it.
It's basically just a little clip-on thing on top, isn't it? It's basically an X you look through.
Yeah, with the Nikonos 3, I think with any of the Nikonos line, they basically it was all non-reflex. And once you got to the wider lenses, like the 20 and the 15, there was a manufactured accessory optical finder that clipped on the top where the strobe connection would go. That was more of a representation of the field of view of the lens. And so, again, same thing. You had enough money. I think I paid $650 for the camera and the lens. I bought it secondhand. And then I went and did this trip to the Channel Islands, and basically when I met some of the people who were going to be on the boat at the dock in Santa Barbara, NPR was there. There's a guy named Chuck Thompson from National Public Radio who's doing a radio broadcast with a renowned underwater National Geographic photographer. And I thought, wow, this is cool. I had no idea this was going to happen. So essentially David Doubilet from National Geographic was on the boat, and he was there to do a story about kelp life and photosynthesis for National Public Radio. So they basically put a microphone in his aga mask. I think it was an aga mask at the time that he had, but he had some sort of breathable speaking mask on, and
like a full face mask.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
And then the first few days of the trip, I got quite seasick, believe it or not. I was just off. I don't know what happened, but I was coming off of a cold, and then I just, for whatever reason, I was not well on that trip, the first few days of it. So I didn't even get in the water. And I think if it was like a 5 or 6 day trip, I mean, I spent half of it not in the water at all. And I thought, oh my God, I've spent all this money to go on this trip, and I brought this camera, and I looked on the work benches and the benches where everyone was having breakfast. They had laid out all their elaborate camera and strobe systems, and there were a lot of very wealthy people who had spent the money to come and do this course, doctors, lawyers, so on and so forth. So they had the latest, I think at the time, the Nikonis RS had come out, which was a self-contained underwater DSLR that, there were motors that could autofocus and zoom, and they would work underwater. They were internally
expensive,
very expensive. And, if you look you can find the bits on eBay, but even the bits on eBay now, even though the camera is defunct, they discontinued it because I think there was so many problems with the camera. But so you knew that. I mean, I go, wow, I finally got a Nikonis, and then I get on the boat, and then but I got the RS, and you're like, oh my God, I'm never going to be able to afford any of this stuff. But so David Doubilet had an assistant with him. His name was Bo Mulder, and I know he sounds like he's a detective on an X-Files episode or something.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
He kind of made a living out of assistant. Al Giddings and Stan Waterman and Jack McKinney and a few other people at the time who were all kind of shooting. They were like the top shooters of that era. And that's back when people, I guess, made a living as being an underwater film photographer. They would think the deal was you took the photos, but you also had to have some sort of a marine biology background whereby you knew, or you had to partner with a marine biologist whereby they knew what the genus of the fish you were photographing were, and the marine life that was endemic to wherever you were shooting. So, and then, basically you would sell the article as a giant package instead of just doing the odd photo here and there.
Right.
So my path of trying to be an underwater stills photographer, when I started talking to some of these people and some of these assistants, they're saying, well, you can submit the photo to the magazines back then, but you're going to get $75 for the photo, and you'll get a credit. But then, the more you get published, the better it is. But you've got to continually assault these dive magazines, and it was basically just diving magazines, or I think maybe Condé Nast Traveler. And basically, as photography and commercial photography and all evolved, you ended up getting guys who didn't specialize in underwater work taking photos and getting these gigantic contracts. And so a lot of the underwater stills guys that I was talking to, they were a little bit, unless you were working for National Geographic, they were a little bit bitter about it. But
right.
Anyway, so I did manage to get in the water and watch Doubilet work. And I like a lot of people were kind of all swimming all over the place and looking at all the kelp and looking at this and that. And I just basically planted myself and watched what he was doing. And I watched how he worked, and I watched his assistant feed him the cameras. He had all the cameras taped with numbers on them, 1 to 5. And he would just hold his hand up with whatever number he wanted while he was shooting. And
the difference between those cameras was different lenses or different film?
That's correct. Yeah. Different lenses, mostly probably the same film, because I think the society, National Geographic had given him, they basically owned all the equipment, and they owned all the, of course, he sent all the film off to them. And then when he got back to New York, he would go over it with a contact sheet and a marker and whatever. But there was E6 processing on the boat. I remember that much.
Oh,
and
really?
So there was some poor guy who was down there developing everybody's film, sweating in that dark room while the boats are rocking back and forth.
The smell of those chemicals would be
sloshing around. So essentially they had a contest, and I went and shot a bunch of stuff. They had assignments, you've got to go and shoot this, and you got to have a subject in the foreground, or you got to have a subject in the background, or you've got to have a subject period, or try to tell a story with your photos. And so it was a very good course. I ended up winning third prize of the boat on the boat for the contest, and basically then Doubilet, awarded everybody. And I think I got a dive bag or a kind of a cooler bag that I ended up my Sony housing or is still in that.
That's cool.
Yeah. So I still use it, but I think first prize was probably another trip on one of those boats. And then basically Doubilet gave a slideshow of his greatest hits and how he achieved them. And for me, in my brain, I was always interested in how things were done. If I went to see a band, I always was watching the band, but that was also watching what the road crew were doing, because I always had an interest in how things were put together, sort of behind the scenes, as it were. And that went back to when I was a kid, and I was using like a tape recorder, and the thing wouldn't work, and I would always try to figure out how it went together or pull things apart. And of course, you always reassemble them incorrectly. You don't know what you're doing. But I always had an interest in how things were made, and obviously I still do. So, and once I had enough, I was still very interested and passionate about taking underwater stills. And then, I got an opportunity to work with Pete Romano, assisting him on a job. And I ended up working with Pete on several jobs. He was discussing insomnia with Al Pacino. I worked with him on that. And I worked with him on 2012, Roland Emmerich disaster movie. And Pete ended up leaving early and handed the reins over to me to shoot for Dean Semler. And that was a major moment for me. And I've always been very appreciative of Pete's support. And I always hold him in high regard. He's been an influence on me, and just his general demeanor with people. You could learn a lot from the way that he held himself with people. I got a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. Like I got a lot of the frustrations, but he would never communicate that to people like Chris Nolan or the director. They would never know what was going on. And so, I found that his demeanor was something to take account of, because I saw so many people in the film industry, and I still see it. Obviously, I've been doing this probably over 30 years now, but tempers flare, egos flare all the time, and how you hold yourself and, keep your shit together. My early learnings of that came from Pete, basically.
I think one of the things that from interviewing Pete recently was just kind of getting an idea of he keeps everything, within him and within his crew, that, all those frustrations, and if something can't be done, like it's within those people, but the people above, the producers or the DOPs or whatever, don't need to know. All they need to know is that you can either do it or you can't do it.
Yeah, I think the frustrations, which there are several, because you don't control everything. You don't control the cast. You don't control the crew that you're working with sometimes. Although, I think so basically your close knit crew that you're working with, like say if it was, my surface assistant is, usually depending on how long you've been working with that one person. And that's why it's difficult sometimes to break in to, back in the day, I can understand sometimes now why it was difficult to break in to some of these tight knit crews. They would have the same people on the jobs that would travel from job to job, and it's just like, you're never going to get in there. And when you start doing it, you understand the value of having someone who's not only got your back, but also has good technical knowledge that can get you out of a bind. Or if it's not that they can get you out of a bind, but they can assist you in getting out of a bind. If you know what you need to do, you also have to have someone who can execute that. Yeah. And, the amount of work that I did with Pete, and I knew that I couldn't screw up. I had to have as high a bar as he did when I was assisting him. And of course I've always had that. That's part of your work ethic and, your standards with which you hold yourself when you're at work, or what you're proud of, or any of this kind of stuff. It's how you hold yourself. And so I've always brought my best, never kind of, half-assed it. These guys aren't paying me much. I'm just going to give them, $50 less. I've never done that. Yeah. But the more jobs I did, the bigger the budgets got. And, it was a lot of things that I had to figure out on my own, because I didn't have those experiences on other jobs. It just seemed that some of them were technically advanced enough that whatever I had done before was not, I mean, it wasn't just the same thing every job. It was always something bigger. So the budget's increased. And so basically then that's kind of how your resume ends up getting built, unless you stay stagnant and just stay doing one thing. And if you're fine doing that, that's great. But I always tended to want, because I was enthusiastic about it and, obsessed in the early days, and I still am, but it was obviously much more, when you're first getting into something that you don't know, you don't really understand it, the enthusiasm and the excitement behind it is greater. It's like any kind of early love affair. It's the same thing. So
yeah, exactly. So when so you're on Insomnia with Pete, what was your kind of first feature, like major feature that was yours, that you were in charge of?
It was a Hellraiser. It was a Hellraiser movie. I think it was, I don't know if it was Hellraiser 5 or 6 or something like that. I can't remember what it was, but
Hellraiser Hellseeker.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that one. And then I was there. I was presented with a case with Ashley. I forgot her last name. She was the female lead in the very first Hellraiser. She was very uncomfortable in the water. So we basically had a car that was submerged, and she was not having any of it. We had to build something on a deck with and pull the door off and basically support the door in some C-stand frames and some combi frames, and have her sitting on an apple box, or basically not an apple box, it's also float, but probably a milk crate that was weighted down with weight belts, and have her sit and pretend like she was pounding on the window of the car, because she would not. And then she could basically just like lift her head out of the water and she would be out of the water.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
She was very, we shot it. I just sort of said, well, we can shoot it tight enough that you can't tell where you are. If I look at it, I can go, well, you can see there's no seats frame. There's no quarter panel in the back. I mean, your overcritical eye will look and say, well, of course she's not in the car. But, in the case with Insomnia, where Al Pacino wouldn't open his eyes, which is his prerogative. As I said before, it's all about the safety and the comfortability of the cast and the talents that you're putting in the water. It's all very well for the director to scream about, you got to open your eyes for these shots. But so Al didn't do any of that. And I was right beside Pete while all that stuff was being filmed. And basically Dodie Dorn, the editor, cut the sequence that you can't. It's so well cut, I thought, that
you don't notice.
No, you don't really notice at all. You just, so Pete and I, anytime we watch that, we'll go, oh, well, yeah, Al wouldn't open his eyes or something like that. I mean, I nearly got my head crushed on that job, because they had these slamming logs. If you watch the film again, when Pacino's character falls in the water, he's trying to swim to the surface and get an air pocket, because he can't see anything but logs overhead. And so there were very, very few air pockets that were available. And I popped my head up because we lost video or something happened, and I popped my head up, and I think I looked up and no one was there, or the crew were in the other corner of the stage. So I popped back down again. I submerged again, and just at that moment, there's this giant clunk noise, and that was the logs, the pneumatic. They were all the real logs, but then the effects guys had, I guess, taken one of those logs and crafted something with a pneumatic press that would slam the two logs together for one shot. But they were practicing it unbeknownst to me. They weren't really paying attention that people were servicing and stuff like that. So anyway, but as we evolve and move on to other things or just other challenges. As far as we were talking about the comic book stuff not being real and being digital. When I got contacted to do Batman versus Superman, that was all done practical in the water. It was the first time that Aquaman was going to be on screen in a film. So that was Jason Momoa's first sort of foray as that character, and he only appears very, very briefly, but that was all done underwater. When none of it was digital, and any of the stuff that we did with Amy Adams or any of the stuff that we went to French Polynesia to shoot, all of it was water. It was water for water. It wasn't dry for wet. None of it was. And I just think that basically they had a different stunt crew on Justice League, and there was a water sequence which that stunt coordinator in particular wasn't really water savvy. Another thing is when you're working in the water with stunt coordinators and stunt teams who specialize in that kind of work. As a gentleman that both Pete and I have worked with before named Tim Rigby, and he was in the Royal Navy. He's a stuntman extraordinaire, and he has got the most calm demeanor in the water and a valuable, extremely valuable asset to have in the water as far as a stuntman, as far as safety of the cast is concerned, as far as the welfare of the whole crew is concerned. Someone like that is really invaluable. And, anytime I've worked with Tim, I'm always overjoyed to see his face, because right. That at least you're going to be covered. I've certainly worked on shows where stunt coordinators their knowledge of any kind of water work is quite limited, and you end up having to do their job while you're doing your job, and lighting and gripping. And it's like I did a picture once with Don Burgess, and the assistants were like, "Wow, this looks really cool. You can swim around with a camera in the water," and everybody kind of has that sort of. And so, Don Burgess turned to them and said, "It's actually a very difficult job. You've got to compose, you have to light, you have to take light readings, you have to grip, you have to swim, you have to control the safety, you have to control your own safety." He was the only one that understood he saved me from having to say anything. So I was like, right. Wow, he gets it, So when you work with people who get it, it's like your job is, you can actually physically concentrate on your job and not have to wear 7 different other hats. So yeah, exactly. It's always a pleasure when you work with people who get it. So,
and do you have a crew that you always tend to, as much as you can, work with? I mean, you travel to different parts of the world so much. How do you kind of deal with that?
I always try to take at least a surface assistant, because they're going to know my gear or the gear that has been rented. And then usually I will bring a grip who also can double as a water safety person, so that I usually, will say that they're going to pull double duty. And it's not that I want to devalue someone to do 2 jobs for the price of one. I usually I don't select anybody's rates and stuff, but we discuss the fact that you are doing 2 jobs and they're both very important. So oftentimes most of the time they don't want you to bring anybody when you travel, and so I have assistants in both the United States and in Canada that I can kind of, because I can usually tell if I'm going to do a job in Toronto that they're not going to fly the assistant as well. They're not going to want to put the assistant up as well. Whereas, there may be, there's one guy there's a couple guys in the States that I work with, but I've taken one person in particular a lot of places because they know the gear. There's never any question like, "Oh, geez, I hope this thing is sealed properly." Right. Certainly throughout the years I've had, with film cameras, I've had a lot of assistants. You train them, and then maybe that just means you didn't train them properly. But, I've had a lot of housing leaks. I haven't had a lot of them, but I've had, the alarm's gone off, and then, the camera bolts to the surface. And when I saw that with other people, I saw, especially on that dive boat when I was, in the 90s, when I was doing the course in the Channel Islands with David Doubilet, a lot of guys had these systems that would come up flooded because they weren't paying attention to the alarm systems. So I always made sure that I had an alarm system in all my camera equipment, and I had insurance for it and all that kind of stuff. But still, you get guys, when I worked with people who were in the water, I always made sure that, and I never flooded a housing when I was an assistant. And so, because I was, obsessed with it, versus someone who just does it because, it's another tool in the toolbox per se. They're not really, they may not pay as close attention. So what I'm kind of getting at is that some of the people that I've, been either given by production, well, we have a guy here who does this, and then, okay, well, let's see how that works. And then you go down that path, and then there's a flood, or there's something happened. You're like, okay, well, this wouldn't happen if my guy had come out. So, and then, then like the next day that your guy's out there. So it's like, It's not like, it's basically just, continuity and
And you have to make the case sometimes to have your crew there, I guess. Like they don't want to spend the money because they've already got someone who does a similar job on the dry side. But it's not until something goes wrong that they go, that's why you need your guy.
That's correct. Yeah. And, it depends on the experience level all the time of the production team. And they'll get it that they won't even, they say, well, who's your assistant? They won't even It doesn't happen. I mean, it happens extremely infrequently because that's a major thing, especially now with the with the focus being on the surface and not attached to the camera housing like it was with film cameras, which I kind of preferred, to be honest with you, because I had a muscle memory with where the focus was. And if you were using, a dome port or a flat port, then, the focus throw would not be as long than it would be if you're doing half in, half out work. But
right. Yeah.
Again, it just depends, right? You're trying to find someone who wants to be an assistant, and everybody wants to get in the water. And,
and as an assistant, you're just not, are you? You mostly
dry. It's a very valuable job to have someone on the surface who can put the equipment together. Now, when I was in a still, doing the still stuff, I know that it's a lot less involved and a lot less complex. But try reloading your film when you've got boat spray and a rocking boat in choppy seas and not get salt water inside the back of the mechanism of the camera. Yeah. So, you learn how to do it quickly, and you learn how to do it and so that you don't screw up, and you actually get, you spend all that money to go on that trip. I did a lot of dive trips to Costa Rica and Cocos Island and stuff. And when you do those reloads, you want to make sure that you are, your photos are going to come out. You're not going to have double exposed images because the film got all bunched up because you were just doing it so quickly that, due to the circumstances. But one thing, as far as when you travel and you either pick up crew where you're working, when I went to Norway went to Svalbard, it's not really in Norway, but I guess the closest landmass to it is it might be Norway, but it also, it's basically the Arctic Circle. So I went there for an IMAX job, and we had battery restrictions with which we could not travel with. And I needed a scooter, and basically sourced a scooter through Kjetil Astrup, who you had on this program. And I've never met him before, but we've kind of communicated through Instagram because I'm not on Facebook. But to me, it was, an underwater brother helping out another underwater brother. So, I really, there's so few people who do this kind of work. And I just think that if everyone was open and friendly like that, that's a good example of, I don't even know Kjetil, but he helped me out. He sourced a scooter, and he knew where to get one, and he got a hold of the name of the contact so that my production coordinator the production coordinator on the job could reach out, so we got the scooter, and we needed it because, on that job we had rolling icebergs that were, we'd be in a Zodiac, and you kind of scan the horizon and say, okay, well, that one hasn't rolled, so we're not going to go anywhere near that. And that one's rolled 20 minutes ago, so let's go shoot over there. So we went and filmed that. Yeah. And then, I got my safety guy who I pleaded with production to bring, and so they did bring him in the end. But he's like, move out of the way, he yelled. And I look up and I see this giant iceberg rotating towards me. So if I didn't have the scooter, I wouldn't have gone out of there quick enough.
Yeah. But, was the scooter enough to get you out of the way or do they just move so slowly?
Oh, they were pretty big. There's a lot of ice melt there. And also we were shooting in one channel, and then suddenly I noticed that the channel was starting to narrow, like this sort of the space, like the water column between the ice flows was starting to narrow because the current's constantly shifting and moving, and the ice is melting and everything else. And so I said, let's just do one more pass. So we did another pass. And then my assistant in the boat, in the Zodiac, who was on the other side of the ice flow, goes, I bet you Ian I bet you he could push that ice flow apart. Right. Like, I bet you he could prevent the thing from. So I was like, well, now you've challenged me. So I said, I passed the housing. I passed the housing to my safety grip, and I said, okay, watch this. And so I pushed the ice flow apart, and I said, see, I can do it. And then I let it go, and of course, it came at me even faster. So then, your moment of bravado turned into like, okay, now we have to get out of here. So.
And the scooter was enough to get you out of there in time?
It was. The problem with me is that I had it on a low speed, right? Because of the shots that we were doing. And so I'm like, we got to get out of here. And I went like really, really slow. And I barely made it out of there in time. But I'm over exaggerating, but still, like, we were way out there. We were way out in the fjords, and if anything had happened, you would have had to have a medevac with a helicopter. And as it was with that job, I did lose a chunk of my finger which is ironic after all this, and with polar bears and walruses and all these other hazards and icebergs and ice flows and all this other stuff. And then I think at one point the crew, the Zodiac, the motor on the back of the Zodiac fell off and went 7 fathoms down to the bottom of the abyssal trench that was below us. And I just so now we have no motor on the Zodiac from the mothership. And so we can just paddle. I'm like, paddle in that current? You're out of your mind. Right. But, we all managed to get it done and stuff. But, we set up a whole system of a pulley system with flags and all this other kind of stuff. And which is why you bring people with you, I guess. But anyway, we got back to shore, and I always demand I need 24 to 48 hours before I fly again. And that's become but it's usually you get something like, oh, really? Can't we just we'll fly you in, you do the job, you're there for a week, and then we're going to fly you out as soon as you're done, because we don't want to pay you anymore. And he's like, well, no, I've got to decompress, right? I need a day to decompress. So I usually try to, exactly. So I try to always make sure and so we did that on that job. And basically we ended up getting checked into a hotel that had some rather flimsy construction, and one of the doors in really, really heavy wind slammed, and it lopped off one of my fingers. And I was like, great. So I had to go to the hospital and get the amputation done. And so, that's a constant reminder of that job. Right. But, and then the job that followed was in a cenote in Mexico. The doctor said, 6 weeks, you can't do anything, no pulling, no pushing, no nothing. Yeah. And I was very worried that I wouldn't have the strength that I had in my hand. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to do something else. And I basically was tenacious enough and exercised and did all the therapy and went to a physiotherapist, and then basically got contacted to do a job for the Marriott in Mexico in a cenote. And that was the first job that I did after that mishap. And then, it was cold water, and, I went down to Hollywood Divers, and I had this elaborate glove system, I'll have this glove thing on, it'll, protect my hand. And of course, I couldn't get the glove on because we had to be in the cenote from 11 until 2, and the sun was coming up, and it was time to roll. And I was still fiddling with the glove, and I go, forget it. So I just threw the glove away and did the job, and all the dead skin came off my hand. And I guess the cenote was it was a cleansing, in a way. I was there to shoot a French freediver, Julie Gauthier, who is the wife of Guillaume Néry.
Yeah, that's right.
Julie Gauthier, she used to shoot a lot of his, there's, what's the name of that? They did it in the Bahamas at the Blue Hole there, the deep.
Oh, Dean's Blue Hole?
Yeah, and it's called Free Fall is the name of the film.
That's when he sinks all the way to the bottom like Superman, and then he free climbs his way back out again. That's correct. Yeah. So Julie was the camera person that shot that. So when I learned that that's who I was going to be shooting in the water, I thought, well, she's going to have an opinion about how I shoot this, because she shot all of Guillaume's work, but she was there to do something completely different. She's just doing some interpretive dance in a cenote, and it was I got to tell you, when I got that job call, and everybody it seemed a bit disorganized, and I just thought, this is not going to go well. And they wanted me to travel with my own gear and not have it shipped, and my assistant and I were in Mexican customs for 4 hours going through every screw and bolt and serial number. And I just thought, I'm never doing this again. This job is going to be a complete bust. And in the end, it was one of the more memorable jobs. I think it was the job that allowed me to realize that I was sort of paranoid about my hand, and that had nothing to do with it. I have all the same strength back in my hand again. Yeah. And it was just the footage that we were shooting was spectacular. It was amazing. And she was a wonderful person. And so in the end, the job ended up being one of the better ones, so. And those cenotes, I've spent a bit of time down there, and they have this quality to them because they're fresh water, and they are all different depths, and the way the light comes in through the cavern ceiling, you get all these amazing lighting effects.
That's correct.
And I feel like it's a very spiritual place.
100%. And I can attest to that because of my own personal experience, but also just with the calm with which, as soon as you submerge, it's a completely different environment. And it just, allows this sort of state of calm to come over you, because I know that I was a little bit nervous about, how am I going to swim and hold the camera and this and da-da-da. Yeah. But anyway, I ended up hiring a safety diver who I dove with. I went cave diving with this one safety diver from France who was living in and so when I went back to where we shot, that spot was in a place called Valladolid, which is inland quite a bit from Cancun.
Right.
And so basically I thought we were going to be shooting in the cenotes that everybody else goes to. And it was, there are masses of tourists in there, and I didn't know how we were going to be able to get a shot without any of these people in the background. But we ended up going to this. A lot of the cenotes are on farmers' lands, so you have to have permission from the landowner to go inside of them.
Yeah.
So we went to this one that was in the middle of nowhere. And so I hired Marceline, who was the safety cave diver that I went out with, months early, I guess like half a year earlier. I was in Mexico for Christmas and went cave diving with him. And so I basically just called him up and said, would you be interested in being dive safety on this job? I know it's not really what you do, but he was all over it. So that's it. It's like basically it's kind of another example of you utilize the people that are in different parts of the world and that you've either worked with or of that can help you. And so that's good to have that network of people to do that. In addition to having, your old guard that have been with you. So.
I mean, that's the thing is, the more open the industry is and the more you can kind of help each other, no matter how small it is, they stick in your head, like Chettle you've got a relationship with Chettle now. If you need something in the future or if he needs something, you've got this kind of relationship sorted.
Yeah, %.
If you'd shut down or if he was like, no, I'm not going to help you because you're the competition or whatever, then it doesn't help anyone.
No. And that's kind of what I would like to, I try to emphasize that, or I try to always be mindful of that. I know that it is competitive, and I know that a lot of people are not necessarily within this realm, but everybody's kind of trying to one up the other person.
Yeah.
And I think every underwater cinematographer or any underwater photographer, whatever you specialize in, you've got a voice you got your own voice with whatever work you're doing, and what you're going to bring to something is any kind of project is going to be different from anyone else, what they're going to bring.
Exactly.
I mean,
yeah.
I think that it's important for me to always make note of the influences that have had a hold on me over the years. And for sure, I mean, anytime I'm looking through the lens, I've got, Terrence Malick, I've got Howard Hall, I've got, David Doubilet, I've got all these references going through my head, and Pete Romano and people that I've worked with and shared experiences with. And basically, when the camera rolls and you've got the four lines of the frame, as far as, when you're shooting, doing cinematography underwater, that's as soon as we start rolling the camera, that's all those influences, art from, Alex Colville or, any kind of photography from Ernest Brooks it's all these things are all running around my head, but then they're funneled into what you're controlling or how you're composing or framing or what have you. And if that resonates, if that resonates with whoever you're working with or whoever you're doing the job for, then that's great. But
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of, you take all those influences and then they're filtered through who you are as a person and how you are as an artist. And that's what comes out the other end. That's correct. Yeah. It's not crystal clear what the influences were. So everyone has a different voice. So everyone brings something different to that production.
That's correct. Yeah. And I can't tell you how many times in the early days I was asked to replicate the shot that Rexford Metz did in Jaws, which was the approach on Chrissy. Everybody wants that. Everybody wanted that shot.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that the water work that he did on that picture is, I mean, if you look at it, and then you look at the housing that's at Panavision in Woodland Hills, and you look through the lens and then you watch the film, you're like, yeah, I can't believe that he could see any focus on that whatsoever, So
that takes me back to something you said before, which is, pulling focus. And you worked as a focus puller for a while. These days we've got remote focus pulling from the surface. But for you, when you came into it, were you pulling focus actually physically on the side of the housing underwater?
That's correct.
So how did that work? I've not had any experience of that. So talk me through.
Essentially,
what that was like.
The prep is all the most important because you need to calibrate the lenses underwater if you're using a dome port. And if you're using a flat port, you wouldn't necessarily have to calibrate the lenses underwater. You had to have a tape measure that was a hard tape measure that had a blank side on the other side of it. So you could have, say, 4 feet from the film plane to the subject, and then you would flip it over, and that would be the underwater computation. So,
right.
If 3 feet is 4 feet or 4 feet is 3 feet, it was 25% magnified when you're using a dome flat port.
Yeah.
And so the focus throws would be quite significant. And you would have to, again, that was all, you'd have to, compute it all. This is where your prep comes into effect, is that you prep your tape. I had an army of tape measures, because when you put, tape measures in the water, and then you finish the job, and then you pull the tape out of the casing to dry it off, and then it's dried, and then you try to retract it. Well, it's all rusted, and then you have to throw it out.
Yeah.
So I tried to resuscitate as many, or I went with the higher end tape measures. These are the 16-foot Lufkin Fat Maxes were the best, I think, because there was only 16 feet that you were trying to push back into the receptacle, not 33 or 50 feet or whatever it was. I ended up going with, for any dome port work, you had to have a chart in the water that was hard mounted to stands or the side of the pool. And basically you would take I had a bunch of fiberglass tapes that I would do, soft tapes, and you would measure out, say, 15 feet, and then you would focus it. And sometimes with certain lenses, if they were anamorphic, you usually had to have diopters on the front of the lenses, because the anamorphic lenses did not close focus enough in order to be able to take advantage of the dome port's abilities. And so most of the anamorphic lenses that would be used would be the Panavision C series, because they were the lightest and shortest lenses on the market. But if you were working with a German or a foreign cameraman who didn't like Panavision, you had to use, and you were shooting anamorphic, then you might be thrust into using these giant Ariscope lenses that half the time the front diameter of the lens would never fit inside the ports that were manufactured. So when you've got a company like Hydroflex, that was probably one of the only, I think it was the only manufacturer of underwater motion picture camera housings for professional use, unless you had your own machine shop or you had spent the $150,000 to make yourself your own housing, you were oftentimes going to have to suggest to the DP that we use different lenses that they physically cannot fit. Because a lot of times when they were asked, let's use the 28 millimeter Ariscope, and it's like, well, the front element is almost the same size as the dome ports. There's no way we can get that. We can't even put the camera together. And then if it's for one shot, and then they look at it and go, I don't like it. Let's go back to the 18. You're like, so, the prep was all important. You had to calibrate there were discs on the outside of the focus knob. And so basically you would mark off all of your distances. And I tried to not, I think that when you're a beginning focus puller, you put marks down for everything, like, 15 feet, 19 feet, as opposed to what I learned later was, like 20, 15, 10, 5, maybe 2.5. And then you'd have to guess where 4 feet or 6 feet or 9 feet or whatever it was. But if you had too many marks, it was too confusing. And then oftentimes, what happened was, the operator would grab the knob and twist it to try to find the focus. And then they would pull the gearing out of alignment, and then the camera has to go to the surface to get reset again.
Oh, I see.
But as long as they didn't touch, depending who you were working with, as long as they didn't touch the knob, and you knew where, like with muscle memory, you knew where 8 feet was, and you were going to do a push in, you could rotate the focus. And then if you looked at the actual lens, it usually said, like the lens, I think the lenses had to be able to close focus to 18 inches in order to be able to take the dome port's effect. And if they didn't, if the lenses were like 2 feet or 3 feet, then you had to use diopters.
Right.
So the markings were so important, because you had no monitor you were pulling focus off.
No, so you're basically looking at the subject and the distance from the camera to the subject and working it out.
That's correct. And we ended up using whips that would, the old Panavision whips. And I think there were some off-market companies that manufacture them. So I bought a whip. There's like a 12-inch whip or a 6-inch whip, which is a whip was basically an extension that comes off of the follow focus that allows you to get further away from the camera. Gotcha. And they were usually made out of a wire material, a thick wire material with a hard rubber coating on the outside. And then they would have a knob. And so in the water sometimes, so I could, if I was going to swim with Pete, I always used a whip, because I didn't want to be all on top of him while he was trying to operate the camera, because the handles and the knobs for the focus, the handles that you're operating the camera with are right beside where the knobs for focus are.
Yeah.
So if you had a whip or some sort of an extension, you were not in his way. And I never wanted to be, your diving skills had to be such that when you were working with an operator or an underwater DP or whatever, and they were swimming back or forward or side or whatever, you had to be able to keep up with them and not tug on the whip, not tug on the housing, not have them frame. Yeah, or they plow into you and then the shot's ruined.
Yeah.
And so, I ended up using a crank as well, which is a small extension that connects inside the whip that allowed me to, do not more aggressive focus pulls, but because oftentimes if it was a wide lens, there's a misnomer that everybody, when they go underwater, shoots with wide lenses. That doesn't always happen. It does happen for establishing shots and that kind of thing. And I think if you shoot with a wider lens, then you run less risk of having the camera being all jittery.
Do you have a preference? I mean, you've worked on with film and with digital. Do you have a preference for one or the other?
I still miss film, to be honest with you. I think that the flicker of the shutter through the eyepiece, I always preferred that, and I miss that. I think there have been more cases with digital work, not with me necessarily, but with surface, on regular shows that are not underwater work by, the operator doesn't know that the camera's rolling. Because they're not, and I sometimes have done that a couple of times where I've been operating on other things on land and I got so into it. I got so into what the four corners of the frame were and what the composition was, and where you get into the scene and you get into that, okay, now I'm going to do a push in here or this, whatever. And then you don't even know that the camera's not rolling because, you didn't notice that there's no red dot glowing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at least with the film camera, you saw the shutter, you knew if it was rolling or not. That's when, maybe that's a minor thing, but I think if it's sort of like whatever you were trained with.
Yeah.
And it may also be, the band that you liked, the first album that you got into that band is always going to be your favorite album. So it's sort of exactly. So it's your first experience. And, on the film jobs, you could not screw up. I mean, yeah, you're going to screw up or it's going to get screwed up. But I think the attention to detail with motion picture film camera housings was far greater, in my opinion, but based on my experience, than the digital work. And it's not slighting the digital work at all. I know that nobody has to go to the lab and worry about the exposure or the printing lights or, any of that kind of stuff. And you're seeing the results immediately, which means there's more of a committee, of course, on the surface behind the monitor. There seems to be just a massive amount of people who are all, usually when it's underwater work, and if there's a tank or if it's scaffolding or if it's a pool if there's an ocean and there's a barge, then there's usually a cacophony of people that are attached to always, standing around watching because they think it's cool or interesting or whatever. But I always prefer a smaller crew, a smaller unit, less of a footprint, less people in the water.
Yeah. Ian, thank you so much. This has been really cool just to kind of listen and you've got so many different points of view on things. And so it's nice to kind of get this kind of overview of the industry. It's really cool.
Well, I really enjoy these podcasts and I'm glad that you're doing them. I'm glad someone's doing them because it's sort of like underwater nerd heaven. It's akin to, when you do go to Panavision and you look at that Jaws housing, for example, you're just like, wow, I can't believe this worked on the Graduate. And, you can't believe how ridiculous it's so big, but it's the same thing. I just get so I'll go on eBay and collect, I know Pete collects posters and stuff, but I've got this book from France on the making of the Big Blue. That's all in French and goes and shows what I saw, where are all the housings? That's because there's no documentary on that, right? And when that film came out, everybody cites that as a reference or an influence. But it was amazing what Luc Besson was able to achieve on that picture, and just it's still with me. That's part of the influences that are still you take little bits here and there, and they're still in the back of your head when you roll the camera. So
totally. And the Big Blue for me was, I don't know if I saw it when it came out, but I saw it around that time, like in the 80s. Yeah, and it was like mind blowing to me. Like that and The Abyss were probably the reasons I do what I do in terms of underwater photography. And And then from that to like seeing, watching Jacques Cousteau and all those old sort of documentary stuff. There's a film that's come out recently called The Odyssey, which is about Jacques Cousteau's life, and seeing that shot, seeing that shot now, but replicating what happened back then was kind of like a time machine for me. Was watching them swim in that scuba equipment, but on high resolution, digital film or whatever they used, was like a looking glass back in time.
I think the one I preferred was The Life Aquatic because, obviously because it's got Bill Murray and Willem Dafoe in it. But I mean, when I heard that there was a parody, or basically it was based on the Cousteau family legacy, I go, and Wes Anderson's doing it, I go, oh my God, this is going to be so good. And when I went to see the film in the theater, I was the only one in the theater laughing out loud. I'm like, what is wrong with you people? Don't you get it? But, I think part of it was, I was laughing at the homage to the Cousteau silver dive suits and the helmets and all that stuff. It was, it's just so quick-witted and quirky. It's so funny. And it still resonates. But I mean, it's just amazing. I love it when they do stuff like that. But I know that these films like Le Grand Bleu and The Abyss and Life Aquatic, to a certain extent, they're massive undertakings to have that many people and bodies in the water on film and to coordinate all of it. It just costs an enormous amount. And I know that it's not on everyone's page as far as when they write that stuff, it's usually the first thing to get cut out of the movie unless it's strictly about that subject. So I'd like to see more in water work than digital recreations. I know that water is very difficult to animate. I know quite a few people in the vis effects departments, and that's fire and water. That's very, very difficult. But to me, as a film viewer, even if you're watching something like Deepwater Horizon, which isn't a rendition of an actual event. Anytime I see any digital stuff, it just pulls me right out of the film. And I get it that it's a Peter Berg movie and stuff, but still, your enjoyment, my enjoyment actually, a lot of it will be based on, not necessarily your suspension of disbelief, but whether or not the story's credible or not. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, Ian, thanks so much, man. It's been really cool.
And, wonderful to talk with you.
You too. And hopefully we'll speak to you soon. Thanks for listening, everyone. And as always, if you like the podcast, please subscribe. If you'd like to connect with us or just learn more about my guests, you can hit our website at theunderwaterpodcast.com or on Instagram or Facebook. Also check out our regular live streams on YouTube. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to know more about my underwater photography workshops and mentoring, you can find me at brettstanley.com. The Underwater Podcast is presented and produced by me, Brett Stanley, and our music is Neo by Oh Boy. Keep creating, everyone. I'll see you in the water.